Thank you for being here today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. And we're conducting this program with our colleagues in the History and Public Policy program, HAP, as we know it, with Peter and Christian Osterman. And today we're talking about a new book by our colleague Jussi Hanhimäki, who was a fellow at the Wilson Center. He is a professor in Geneva at the Graduate Institute there, and has worked long on issues between the United States and Europe. His book is Pax Transatlantica, Europe and America in the Post-Cold War Era. It just came out. It's the Kindle version is available, as well as the book through Oxford University Press, or you can get it in many of the electronic delivery channels that you will all know. So Jussi, thank you so much for joining us. What we're going to do is have Jussi tell us a bit about the book, so kind of the key takeaways he hopes readers will gain from it. And then I'm delighted our colleague Christina Spohr has joined us from London. Christina also has been very active with the Wilson Center, and she and I have been working together for the last few years over at Johns Hopkins. Christina, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Christina is a prolific author, and also exactly on these same topics. So Christina will comment a bit and engage Jussi a bit in conversation, and I'll come in, and then we'll weave in questions from the audience. You can ask questions in the chat. You can also, I think, raise your digital hand if that works, and we'll try to take all those into account. So, Jussi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and look forward to this conversation. Please tell us, what's the book all about? Why did you spend time doing this?
Great. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for hosting it. Also, the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center, as well as, of course, History and Public Policy program, Christian and Peter. And also thanks, Christina, for taking the time to. I know you have many other things going on at the moment with the LSE and so forth. So that's a bit pressing, I know. So, but thank you for taking the time. It's nice to see all of you here. Also, thanks for everybody who is out there somewhere, whose names and faces I cannot quite see at the moment. So, yeah, let me, as Dan mentioned, the place to start. I was thinking, what's the best place to start? It's in 2002, 2003, actually, as Dan said, I was a fellow at the Wilson Center. And what many of you, those of you who were around at the time, perhaps remember, that's the year when there was a big transatlantic crisis. It was about the Iraq War. And of course, the fact that the French and the Germans were not particularly keen to support the American-led adventure in Iraq in the spring of 2003. So it was an interesting time, of course, to be in Washington, D.C. It was a time when we heard all about freedom fries. We heard about surrender monkeys. We heard about, on the other side, the United States being the biggest rogue state on the planet, running roughshod over diplomacy and multilateralism and all the rest of it. So days of Mars and Venus, it's those of you who remember Robert Kagan's book, a short book about the transatlantic relationship at the moment. And of course, it's something that then Dan and his colleague Joe wrote about, the fact that, well, actually Mercury is another other aspect in that particular relationship. So it was an interesting one thing that sort of stood out. I went to a lot of these types of events, not online, but very much live events. And there was a lot of talk about this big crisis. And I, at some point, did raise my hand in one of these events and asked very innocently about, well, are you sure this is such a huge crisis in transatlantic relations? I mean, what about, say, the Vietnam War? What about the Suez crisis and so forth? So I was politely told that those were all peripheral crises, whereas this one was really, really central to the transatlantic relationship, and everything hinged upon what was going to happen in terms of whether we were going to have a transatlantic alliance going forward or not. That there was a big bust up in this, oh la la, this is the big one, and now we better brace and find a way out of it. Now, the point why I'm telling this story is this sort of where I started where the idea for the book was. Because this, obviously, those many of you who followed transatlantic relations over the past few decades or longer in some cases perhaps, know that that's just one crisis among many. And that was a crisis that came and passed. The differences were smoothed afterwards. That in fact, as one book put it, this was just another major crisis. And while predicting sort of transatlantic drift, no, this was part of a sort of an ongoing roller coaster ride when it comes down to transatlantic relations, not only after the end of the Cold War, and my book of course focuses on the period since the early 1990s, but even if you start looking at the Cold War period itself, we could find numerous crises that came and yes, were then resolved. So my starting point really for the book, and where I often get these pitying looks about being sort of blue-eyed and not serious, is when I tell people, well, maybe this crisis, whatever the current crisis is perhaps not the terminal crisis in the end for the transatlantic relationship. And so where I sort of begin with the idea for the book is the sort of this paradox that I find in transatlantic relations, having also perhaps lived a little bit myself as a sort of between United States and Europe and Canada also at some points in time, is that on the one hand we have what we often call the most successful alliance in NATO. We have this very close transatlantic relationship, a community, perhaps a transatlantic community that exists, that is based upon all kinds of institutional arrangements, that is deeply embedded in different patterns of trade and investment, in which political systems on both sides of the Atlantic, they are not identical, yet they are broadly speaking similar, especially if you think about the globe as a whole. And that there is there are the interests and the values that bind us together, as we often hear from the mouthpieces of various types of organizations, including of course NATO and so forth. And at the same time, so that's one, I think, a reality, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's also this idea of a constant conflict, or the reality of what seems to be a constant conflict, the pessimism that somehow, and we've seen, I think, this play out very clearly over the last few years during the Trump presidency, on how many were wondering, and one could cite a lot of journalists and others about the end of NATO, about the end of the transatlantic relations, the end of the West, more broadly speaking, that is just behind the corner, there's about to be a big bust. But it's a house of cards that just somebody's going to pull one card out and it's all going to collapse. And we've seen, I think the starting point therefore is that there's this constant crisis mentality that takes place against this reality, I would say, of these deeply embedded institutional arrangements, deeply embedded patterns of interaction, whether in terms of trade and investment or in the field of politics. So I wanted to attack that problem. I wanted to think, and then thinking about how best to attack, and it's a little bit about the structure of the book, which is a very small book in the end. And I like to tell people, there's this old joke that a man was asked, why did you write such a big book? Well, because I didn't have time to write a short one. Last year, I had plenty of time because of COVID, because of the lockdown, so I didn't need to travel anywhere. So I used the time to try to finish this work up. But the problem is, how do you approach this? You write a narrative starting from 1990 coming to 2020. And the reason I chose not to do that what you would have is, in fact, this sort of a roller coaster narrative. You would say up and down, up and down, up and down. There's a crisis, there's a solution, there's a crisis, there's a solution, and onward we go. So rather than doing that, I thought maybe look at a few themes that seem central to the transatlantic relationship and how it functions internally, rather than sort of vis-a-vis necessarily the rest of the world. And of course, the three obvious suspects in this regard, or aspects or themes to look at for security arrangements, so particularly NATO, which I call the guardian of Pax Transatlantica, economics, broadly speaking, trade, investment, and trade not just in the sort of traditional form of trade, like as in goods, but rather trade in what is increasingly the pattern in transatlantic relations, trade in services and so forth, and politics. Because I think politics are, and by politics what I mean is not necessarily the state-to-state relations between presidents and prime ministers, but rather the internal politics within what I broadly consider the transatlantic political space, and trying to find out what are the different patterns that of interaction within that we can perhaps see, and compare and contrast between the two sides of the Atlantic. So the central point, I think, that if what I sort of took out of this is a sort of looking at these overlapping transatlantic spaces, security, economics, politics, and what finds, and that's the sort of the key takeaway, is that is notwithstanding the ongoing sort of sense of crisis, the repeated crises that we see in the headlines, whether it's about Iraq, whether it's about Boeing versus aircraft, whether it's Trump's tweets, whatever it might be, we actually see a very closely sort of expanding security space and deeply integrated. We see a closely connected economic transatlantic space, especially when we start looking at and in the foreign direct investment and so forth. And also we see political space in which similar developments evolve, or similar evolution, broadly speaking, has taken place on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that might be perhaps the more controversial issue aspect of this whole book. And the conclusion I come basically is that the West has actually grown closer over the past 3 decades rather than the other way around, rather than what one might get the sense that this is really a relationship that's about to bust up anytime or at a very short notice. So just very quickly in sort of more concrete terms, so if one looks at for the three aspects that I mentioned, security, economics, and politics, security in terms of NATO, notwithstanding, comments about it becoming what we of course have since the 1990s, a lot of controversial issues, a lot of conflicting perceptions about the purpose of NATO and so forth, whether it's about the out of area issues, particularly in the immediate post 9/11 era, the point that I was mentioning in the beginning, whether it's about questions of burden sharing. The United States and Trump, of course, was famous about repeating the argument that in fact the United States is basically protecting everybody and paying for everybody's defense, and the magic 2% target at the minimum that the Americans have been actually demanding for quite some time, even in the pre-Donald Trump presidency. And these are, serious issues. There are a lot of conflicts about this. These are issues that have led to talk about, statements that policymakers make. Only very recently, of course, we have Trump. I mean, you could find a legion of statements about how obsolete NATO has become, how maybe the United States has just quit. Macron, French President Macron, who talked about NATO as being brain dead because of its lack of strategic perspective and so forth. So we have this sort of, even in the more recent history, the ongoing sense of crisis. And at the same time, if you look at the 30-year period since 1990, the really noticeable aspect is enlargement. That you have the NATO that back when it was formed, a collection of 12 countries has expanded as of 2020, when North Macedonia became the latest NATO member, has expanded to 30 countries. So this, to me, is the sort of trajectory that if you're running a business, you would very much like to see. It's a trajectory of growth that is perhaps unimaginable in many other aspects. And it's also not only enlargement. NATO has done what it was not supposed to do, and did not do for its first 4 decades. It has gone out of area in a limited way, yes, but to Afghanistan and other places, and training missions in Iraq and so forth. It has grown, it has gone out of area, expanded, and of course the statement in the 1990s about either you have to go out of area or out of business. Well, NATO did not go out of business, certainly did go a little bit out of area. Its mission has become increasingly expansive. NATO, it is not just a military alliance that is there to deter another military alliance, as was the case in the Cold War with the Warsaw Pact. It has become an active organization, military. It's, and then talk about the 360-degree defense or strategic doctrine. And of course, more recently, then we raised the other elephant in the room, China, as NATO's potential next the security concern. And even one could say that some of the burden sharing aspects of the relationship began to be addressed by European countries. So, long story short, NATO is neither obsolete nor brain dead. NATO is thriving. It is looking into, I would argue, a fairly bright future. It has certainly in the last 3 decades expanded exponentially in terms of the area it covers, in terms of the missions it undertakes, in terms of its sort of popularity also in many countries as well. Now, the second aspect, economics, I think just briefly, and of course, Dan is the true expert in this field, in this particular online event. So I'll try not to put my foot in my mouth too badly. But it's true, I think, in terms of the transatlantic economic relationship, that we've seen an enormous number of negative headlines about various trade spans over the past 3 decades, or much longer if you go back to even to the 1950s and 60s. It is true that the transatlantic trade and investment partnership is very much on ice, I think, still, even in the early months of the Biden presidency. That ambition of creating a true sort of transatlantic free trade area of some sort is still far in the horizon in many ways. It is true that China has become resurgent and has become the chief source of imported goods, but for both the United States and the European Union as of today. So that's all true, and that might imply that there is less of an integrated, less of a connected transatlantic marketplace, or economic space rather, today than we might than many economists or policymakers might like to see. At the same time, the reality again is that there is a highly integrated transatlantic, intercontinental transatlantic marketplace, which is extremely wealthy. It is the wealthiest marketplace in the world by far. And it is true that the fortunes, the economic success of countries on both sides of the Atlantic, or both sides of the North Atlantic, I should say, tend to sort of rise and fall together, which implies a high degree of interconnectivity in the economies. You know, you just witnessed the Great Recession of a decade or so ago as an example of that. And perhaps most importantly, it is also true that when one does the numbers, one finds that foreign direct investment going both ways across the Atlantic is massive and far outstrips foreign direct investment flows in any other sort of intercontinental or transcontinental way. Trade in services is huge. Europeans provide, and to North America and the other way around, much more. That the value of the trading services is far higher than whatever small amounts of trading services that comes, from example, from China. The transatlantic relationship, economic relations, is important in terms of job creation. It's the digital markets have truly taken off over the last decade ago, in the last decade or so, and so. In other words, whatever we see about the trade spats, about Boeing versus Airbus, which of course was recently resolved, the reality is that we have in the North Atlantic space a relatively closely integrated marketplace that is interconnected in terms of investment, and it's interconnected in terms of its sort of economic fortunes. If the United States suffers a recession, or it will hit Europe quite obviously, and the other way around, perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent. So now the third point, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'm a little bit rushing here, but politics. And what I find, this is of course the stuff of high controversy, and we've seen the rise of populism in particular over the past decade or so. I mentioned the Great Recession, and many analysts would argue that that's the start of the sort of the current wave of populism, and the wave that brought a number of the populist parties into power, or close to becoming in power across Europe, as well as perhaps affected the fortunes of Donald Trump, and possibly played some role in the Brexit vote in 2016. And nationalism on the rise is to many a very sort of, if it's populism / nationalism on the rise, is of course a worrying phenomenon to many. At the same time, what's interesting to me as an observer of this, and I must say I'm a neutral observer with carrying Finnish and Swiss nationalities, so I'm a super neutral observer of all this. It seems to me that if looking at patterns, broad patterns in the domestic politics on the two sides of the Atlantic over the last 3 decades, there's a certain sameness, certain similarity, patterns that seem to be fairly similar on whether it's North America or Europe, and I think it all sort of started, and I don't think we saw this quite in the same way in the Cold War, and I've sort of traced this historically back to the end, basically the end of the Cold War, and what happens is the sort of the end of ideology as we knew it, in a sense that the old labels like left and right and so forth seemed to lose at least some of their cachet in the 1990s. What we saw in the 1990s was the rise of the so-called third way politics, initially, and some of the torch barriers like Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, perhaps Gerhard Schröder, and others in Europe. That was sort of what you could call the sort of the more moderate left in some ways, but which tried to find some kind of a marriage in between the old left and the old right and so forth, and to leading on to the sort of shift to the more conservative direction, I think, in the early 2000s, and then the rise of populism, which we see take place roughly, not exactly, and of course different nations have different individual trajectories in this regard. But if you think about the last decade or so and the much talked about rise of populism, you of course see populist parties in gaining power, or coming close to gaining power in countries varied as Finland with the so-called True Finns. We see the UKIP party in the UK making great strides, momentarily only, but in the runoff to the 2016 Brexit vote and so forth. We see the Front National, there is the Liga in Italy, and then of course there's the Trump supporters in the United States. In 2016, often seen as the sort of the banner year of populism, with the twin shocks, as it were, to many of the Brexit vote on the one hand, and then a few months later, Donald Trump's election as the U.S. president. Now, what all that, I'm no great fan, obviously, of populism and so forth. And many of the people and parties that I mentioned, I have no sort of affinity to any of them. But to me, they sort of indicate something else, which is that something similar is happening in the political world on both sides of the Atlantic. That the rise of populism respond to the concerns shared by large groups of people. And of course, the Trump supporters are still going on about the election and so forth in the United States. But they're responding to similar concern with some national variation about globalization. The chief culprits of their lack of fortune, which are globalization and so forth. And we see that play out across the transatlantic space roughly at the same time. Not all populists gain power, but we also see, I think, certainly in what I would argue I have observed in the last year or two, is the pushback also on both sides of the Atlantic against the rise of populism. That sort of international liberal response, the defense of the international liberal order. And I think those things, those patterns, can be observed, I think, in most countries within what I call the transatlantic political space. Now, what does all that mean? What is the conclusion of all of this? Well, you have to, of course, read the book, buy it first, buy 2 of them, and it's not quite Christmas time, so doesn't make us make a nice present yet. But maybe there's July 4th or something coming up, and you wanna share that. But to me, the sort of, given the history of this that I sort of very, very briefly described, or in the book in the end, of these overlapping transatlantic spaces, I think one of the takeaways is that, and this might have been more revolutionary if the book had come out a year ago. I think I would have been pushed back. But now that Trump lost, so now everything is back to normal, right? So the crisis is over. Many seem to assume. We have, adults in the White House, and we have, normal meetings at the G7 and NATO, and with the EU and the United States and so forth. I would say there will be another crisis in the transatlantic relations soon enough to come. But one of the points, perhaps the biggest point that I try to make in the book, is that the evolution of transatlantic relations, certainly in the last 3 decades, shows to me that the Cold War era, which is sometimes considered sort of a golden age of transatlantic relations, in fact, it wasn't a golden age because there were plenty of crises back then, but B, actually, transatlantic relations have, despite what most perhaps would argue, grown somewhat closer over the last 3 decades, rather than, I don't agree with the argument that there's been some kind of transatlantic drift. And I think that's my general advice to anybody who accepts that notion is that even if you don't accept it, is that next time when a crisis arrives, as I said, it will be prompted by a remark by an American president, the French president, perhaps a British prime minister, or something like that. Next time there'll be a trade spat. There definitely will be one in the coming years. I don't know exactly about what, but that is very, very likely to come. Next time there is a military excursion not uniformly supported, or in military intervention not uniformly supported by all NATO countries, and so forth. And when you hear the inevitable result, which is somehow either NATO is about to collapse or the transatlantic relationship is meeting its end, imminent end sometime soon, think twice, think about the history, think about the ups and downs, the roller coaster ride that the transatlantic relationship has been on for the last 75 years, and including the last 30 years. And just think about that, and then take a deep breath and sort of try not to get stuck in the moment. As we often do, when the US president tweets NATO is obsolete, let him tweet, right? It doesn't necessarily make NATO obsolete. I think that's my one lesson of the Trump years, certainly. Because in the end, I think the West, broadly speaking, the transatlantic relationship, more specifically, actually thrives on conflict. It thrives on disagreement. It is based upon ongoing, endless renegotiation of the rules, of the interactions of those rules within those rules, and it is sort of destined, it seems to me, at least for the immediate future, to remain at the same time united and divided. That there's unlikely to be a sort of an end game in this particular relationship that goes definitely one way or the other. But at the same time, the structural connections, what I've been talking about, the institutional arrangements, the patterns of economic investment and trade are so strong that it will take more than an election of a president, or a trade spat here or there, or even a military intervention in an area that causes a great deal of resentment to bring the West or the transatlantic relationship apart. And I think I will probably stop there. I hope I've sort of given you a few takeaways, hopefully provoked somebody. I'm sure, hopefully maybe provoked Christina and Dan to cause me to take back everything I just said. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So your book is focused on the post-Cold War period, and you mentioned you had pointed to earlier crises during the Cold War period, and we're told that it was different. Christina is an historian and has focused a lot on exactly that transition time from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, and reflecting on maybe what's different is an important insight. So Christina, having heard this and Jussi and his work, maybe you can join in our conversation, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jussi, very much for your great talk, and thank you for letting us have your book to comment on it and the first reactions. And I would quite like to point out now that if you want a short book for your summary to take away on your holiday as a think piece, then this is a great book, because above all else, it's not about where you go and hunt particular footnotes or sources. It's really about where you start asking questions and perhaps look at it in new ways. And what really struck me that also came out in this conversation is, yes, your book is focused, of course, on the last 30 years, but in the various chapters, you dip into a different past. And let me comment a little bit on this, because there's sort of something interesting to be said about the beginning and the end point of this book in some ways, especially as you said, you kind of, you finished writing it in the lockdown. Well, we are still in a lockdown, but also with the end of an era, of a Trump era, and now we are moving into something else, and we have to see where it's taking us. But in some ways, your starting point is a moment in history when on Dan's side of the Atlantic, Francis Fukuyama said it's the end of history. It's universalization of democracy. We're moving into these 1990s, these heady hopes that there were, this sort of sense of the United States emerging as a unipole, but perhaps also, if we think back these 1990s, because what was this post-Cold War era? Perhaps a time when there was in some ways a lack of what is the next big idea, other than that there may be this linear narrative of further democratization, of expanding the market, of civilizing the world under an auspice of international law, UN authority, you name it, the sort of idea of, Zivilmacht, civil power, and the application thereof, as some political scientists say. And now, if we look at some of the quotes that Jussi uses in his book, in some ways, this dystopia that sort of has been emerging, this sort of, is there an end of the West, as we are confronted with a revisionist Russia and an ascending China, and perhaps the sense that there is a shift of the global order, both in terms of the power, but also in terms of new crises that we can't yet sort of really work out where they're going to take us. The climate emergency, as the UN calls it, but we could say, this is a systemic, transnational, global affair that affects us all, irrespective which camp we are in, how we respond, something that in some ways is systemic, that is more difficult to grapple with. The onset of digitization and artificial intelligence, the question of migrationary flows, just to name a few things that give us a sense of uncertainty, irrespective of this other, perhaps more tectonic shift. Where are we going in terms of the balance of power? Are we going, or are we calling it perhaps already a more multipolar world? You play with this quote by Kissinger a couple of times in your book. This sort of questions, how much unity do we want and how much diversity can we stand? Where also does this Pax Transatlantica, or I could also call it the Euro-Atlantic relationship, both in terms of values, economics, politics, stand in this shift of how the international system may be evolving? And if we are again at a hinge moment or coming up to it, or perhaps already in it, then is here another shift of the international order where we are looking at these different areas that is perhaps taking place peacefully, just as it did 30 years ago, whereas of course all the other previous big reordering moments in world history, in modern history at least, happened through war. One side destroyed the other, and then there was a change. And that is more difficult to grapple with, because it brings in the question of certain systemic developments that are already touched upon, but also then the agency of leaders and institutions that are trying perhaps to shape which direction this may be going. So to come to my second point, which is a word that you use as well when we look at the 30 years within those bookends that we talked about. On the one hand, the beginning, these heady hopes for the West, then this dystopia just before, the COVID crisis hit and made us think about other things and wider crisis sentiments. This question, is the West divided? Is it degenerate? Is it demoralized? Is it decadent? Is it dysfunctional? Is it all disintegrating? Where is it all headed? So from the excitement of hope to complete dystopia, what is our Erwartungshorizont? What are our visions of the future in that Euro-Atlantic community? And of course, you actually take And this is the wonderful thing about your book. You get to the end, you think, okay, so where's it all headed? There's a next crisis and whatever. Actually, there's something very positive. You give us a positive message. You say, actually what is important is the glue that holds us together, that for all our diversity, which is a reflection also of democratic argument, that we can argue and discuss. And of course, not every nation state and every nation and every population thinks the same. We can't even agree all amongst each other in one country. But if we have, a civilized conversation, this is what keeps us driving forwards. And there's also something that holds us together. And if we look at it, it has already held us together for many decades, not just the last 30, but of course, already in the Cold War context. Then, of course, and that's what's so interesting in your first chapter, as we sort of dip back, so we have this sort of cyclical development between ups and down, between cooperation and then again, having tensions and then forging ahead again. One might say, well, is this a straitjacket? Are we somehow stuck in this? But on the other hand, there also seems to be a sort of linear movement trying to think of new things. I mean, Stoltenberg and NATO just put forward, there has to be a new NATO strategy, 2030, dealing with the new challenges, looking at things afresh, giving new purpose to an institution that started in a completely different context. And of course, that was this frozen international overarching context, international system of bipolarity, with the overlaying ideological antagonism that brought about different economic systems and so forth. That all fell away in some ways through our exit from the Cold War as, the global economy, the spread of capitalism, those kind of things took a momentum of their own. And even China, as it exited the Cold War in its own kind of way, combined authoritarian communism, if you so want, with the capitalism and integrating into the global economy. So looking into our Euro-Atlantic relationship, which is sort of your main focus in the book, Pax Transatlantica, and hanging it on these three themes, security and economics, and then what's happening in the polity and politics. What also struck me, and what is very interesting is, this whole business with the NATO, of course, it was this defensive organization in that Cold War context as part of one bloc. Then as the Cold War ended and one moved out of it, on the one hand, you give us a sort of sense how NATO became part and in different ways involved in certain new out-of-area conflict as a sort of peace enforcement tool. In that sense, its mission changed, just as, of course, in terms of its size, it also changed, not because it was some sort of pressure just from within NATO, no, because other countries, the Central and Eastern European countries, post-Soviet states, they looked and knocked on the door of that organization, which pointed in some ways to its success. It gives agency to another part of Europe so that Euro-Atlantic community, that Pax Transatlantica, if you so want, is actually now a bigger sphere than what it was in the Cold War context. And it's something I will ask you later on, but I want you to think about it already. When we think about this Iraq War 2003 that caused so many ructions, there was, of course, all this talk about, is the old or the new Europe with us? The Americans played on that, the old and the new Europe. Of course, now, 20 years later, the so-called new Europe, or some of them anyway, are trying to say, well, we are actually the real Europe, because we as Hungarians, we are really pushing for our nation and our nationalist ideas, whereas the EU is this sort of weird post-national, awkward liberal institution that takes away from our nation. So that's not the real Europe. The real Europe is actually where our heart is, in our nation. And so if you want the real Europe, you need to look at Central Europe. So there's sort of an interesting tension of how the narratives are being played out, because of course what happened in the early 90s, the narrative was all about freedom, reunifying Europe, joining the Euro-Atlantic community, forging around values, institutions and organizations that hang together for those reasons. And now that's almost turned around, as in saying, by some of them saying, at least when it comes to Europe, is that really what we want? Is that not something where we have given up sovereignty? Isn't it actually destructive to us and our national identity, which leads to this other tension that you point out in your chapter on populism? This question of, do you revert inwards and is it all about the nation? Or is it also something, you know, across states, transnational, cross-national, a phenomenon that affects us everywhere, which is maybe a sign of its time? So another final theme, perhaps, before I sort of go into asking you a couple of questions. You talk in your book early on about this paradox that you want us to think about, this paradox between you know, tensions and diversity, and on the other hand, this push on cooperative measures. And of course, that was a big theme also in the 1970s, when from when on, actually, which relates to another chapter of your book, we see another sort of systemic change, you know, with this sort of rise of neoliberalism, globalization, the global economy on the one hand, but then inside the NATO, serious transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic disagreements, if you so want. What and how do we secure ourselves? This all happened over the NATO dual track decision, but you could ask that same question now again over the INFs, over the question, you know, is Germany carrying its responsibility in the organization? Should the Europeans do more? And as NATO is in some ways acting much more out of area, what does that mean for more regional defense? And what does that mean for defense spending and taking in some ways that responsibility to act further afield when it comes to questions of peace enforcement or war on terror or whatever the next crisis may be, which is very interesting. So my first question to you, because this is a sort of think book, and we're trying to get to grips of this sort of 30-year period. There is sort of literature where one looks at that period as in, you know, one sort of linear narrative, the sort of civilizing narrative or the triumph of the West. And then there's a literature that talks about, oh, this is all actually sitting in a much wider economic story. You know, there's a collapse of Bretton Woods and a new system and the economic crisis of 2008. How do you, if you had to sort of situate yourself, so for the sort of, let's say, more academic audience, how would you situate yourself in among a couple of books that you engage with where you sort of thought, that's interesting, they're looking at the same but from a very different perspective than I did, which is the reason why you wrote the book the way you did?
Thank you. First, thank you, Christina, for making all the taking the trouble to read the book and give me such great comments on this. I think I mean, and there's a few things that I would like to maybe come back to afterwards in terms of how one situates oneself with other authors. I think, I mean, you're right. This is not a deeply researched narrative of everything that happened in the last 30 years in terms of the transatlantic relationship. I think that to an extent that's being done or has been done by many others, focusing often on Europe. I mean, you've done your own work on the transformation that takes place to sort of the end of the Cold War and how all of that works. I think where I wanted to sort of, I mean, mainly I wasn't actually thinking of other historians too much when writing the book. I knew what kind of book I wanted to write. I wanted to write the sort of Robert Kagan type book, but arguing more or less the opposite. Rather than arguing that Americans and Europeans live on different planets, they're from Mars and then the others are from Venus, which and so forth. I want to see if there, you know, if that, first of all, that seemed slightly ridiculous to begin with, but in a sense, what I was really thinking about, there's something going on. Then this is, I confess, it's part of my, and I talk a little bit my personal experiences in the introduction to the book, but it's a bit of the sense that, you know, people often use this term lately, that something feels true or it doesn't feel true, right? To me, it never felt true that there was some kind of a unbreakable crisis in the transatlantic relationship. And perhaps it's just because it was so easy to go back and forth until COVID came, and between the two continents, and perhaps because I come from a privileged small group of academics who, go around in conferences, meeting other academics. And what I really wanted to find out, well, is that just, am I living in a bubble of academic in the sense, or is there something that really has taken place in a broader sense that makes it sensible to talk about a transatlantic space? And my general answer was yes, but it's a very, it's that there's general trends, but of course, as you already pointed out, there's a big difference if you are in Hungary, or if you are in London, or if you are in Helsinki, or if you are in Washington or San Francisco, or Ottawa for that matter. So it was really about making sense of this this paradox that you mentioned, between, on the one hand, you always hear this is the great, NATO is the most successful military alliance in history, right? You always hear that, and then the next time you hear it, it's obsolete. Now, how do you square that circle? It's impossible to square. So I really wanted to delve into that paradox without actually worrying about what other scholars were saying. I knew, and I confess, it's not the deeply sort of deeply researched book in a sense that for example, yours is. That I haven't gone to any archive to write this particular book. Perhaps I will in the future, because there are obviously therefore many sort of factual gaps in the analysis that I provide. So
yeah, I didn't ask you the question really as a criticism at all, because I think it's very much because you make us think and because you ask questions. I also found this the terminology when you talk about transatlantic space. I found that very attractive, because it made me think of Dan, for example, both as a practitioner but also in his writings, often makes about this distinction: America in Europe and America as a European power. And in some ways, having really become and stayed a European power ever since it became involved, and how, because in the NATO then in some ways offers an umbrella of stability, which was a big issue also, of course, in the 1990s to stabilize the capitalist democracies of Eastern Europe. How, of course, that, and then combined with the adaptability, shows the attractiveness of this empire by invitation or integration, to borrow those kinds of terms that have also been used before. And what struck me as well is in this dystopia of, even when the coronavirus was raging and there was all this debate on who's dealing best with it and all this vaccine nationalism, whatever. And, we keep having repeated this sort of phrase, yeah, but the Chinese dealt much better with it. And then you could say now, well, but do the Chinese vaccines really work? And even if they're vaccinating a lot of people, what do we really know about figures? We don't really have transparency. You actually could ask a lot of questions. Equally, you could say, isn't it striking how, if we look at how many vaccines actually seem to work, how many of them were created in this very transatlantic space? So you can really see the sort of the power of creativity, the power that it's not actually state controlled, but yes, there was of course financial power behind it, but the sort of sparkle, the electricity that from unexpected sources and places, new inventions could happen, is possible precisely in this space. Which leads me to this other theme where you talk about populations and the power of democracy, but at the same time also how democracy is only as strong as the people's belief in it. And why have we seen this turn by people, or the attraction of these sort of slightly more authoritarian types, especially on the right, in populations, so that we see the vote sort of being stratified, and we are seeing more on the right strong men gaining electoral small or larger victories. And I would like to ask you sort of a counterfactual question that I've been sort of toying with. When we think, for example, of the Trump phenomenon or also the Brexit, because it ties in with this other theme in your book where you talk about how from the 90s we got this rise of the moderate center left, you know, the Blairs, the Schröders, and so forth, Clinton. And I ask myself, when 9/11 happened, and when America set its mind on that they need to find Osama bin Laden, and they found him 10 years later, that's fine. But 2003, you know, if you ask yourself what changed or what wouldn't have changed, if America and Britain, because it was them really who sort of pushed it together, hadn't gone to Iraq, and one hadn't ended up in that quagmire, how important is that decision for, in some ways, the rise of the Trump phenomenon? The fact of this, that there was this regime change policy, that, you know, in some ways that brings Obama to the fore, because Obama was against the Iraq war. It wasn't Clinton who won the election, you know. So in some ways, you know, if there had been more like a Clinton McCain competition, would that have been different than if Obama would have come as a response in some ways to that 2003? How important was the 2003, both that we end up with in Britain with the Brexit, because it brings out certain people, because, you know, Blair and the Labour Party, Blair being dead, Blair, you know, this whole thing comes from that moment. And so, although we are talking a lot about, you know, societal and systemic changes, I'm asking myself, if there had been different combinations of people, would the elections perhaps gone differently? How important was this 2003 moment? What do you think?
So, I think twofold answer. Number one, I think, yeah, things would have been different. I think in terms of sorry, in terms of the I mean, absolutely right. One of the problems of the Iraq war in general is that it allowed that it prompted a degree of isolationism, I think, in both parties. I mean, if you think about the United States, the fact that, you know, of course, there was initial outpouring of support, and, you know, I sort of lived in Washington at the moment of when all this started, so you could see that the patriotism, you know, overrode the concerns about the consequences in the short run. And of course, George W. Bush is popular, and his popularity did not suffer from the initial decision, and then, you know, the whole mission accomplished stuff that went on in that context in the first few months. But I think as a consequence, it sort of also allowed, because that was not the end of it, as we well know, over time, if of course allows sort of this sort of critics of what became the unilateral approach to American foreign policy or American grand strategy and so forth. And as well as those who would argue, and I think this is sort of where the Trump thing comes in perhaps somewhat, is those who argue the United States, you know, it's just build a wall around and forget the rest of the world, because it's a messy place, and every time we get sucked into conflicts that really don't matter and just cost a lot of money and so forth. So I think in that sense, yes, it allowed for political openings of different sorts. I mean, it allowed the sort of return of the liberal internationalist argument a la Obama, one could argue, that, you know, one of the problems with the Iraq war and so forth, not only was it the wrong war, but it's also, you know, destroyed alliances and created all that. And on the other hand, it also allows the sort of openings within the right for those who would say that, you know, we can't just, you know, the neocon dream about going out there and democracy spreading is total nonsense. That the real world doesn't work like that, that we can't go around changing people's societies and political systems and so forth. So we better just stay home. and if need be, build a wall against Mexico and make them pay for it or whatever. You can. But of course, the trajectory is quite long from there. And I think in the end, if you're thinking about the Trump phenomenon, if you think about the Brexit phenomenon, Iraq war is very much old news by the time we come to 2016, certainly. For most people, it may have had an impact. What is really gnawing on at them is the aftershocks of, well, we call it the Great Recession, that is sort of seen as the economic downturn of 2008, 2010, and so forth, as a consequence of globalization and everything that globalization represents. You mentioned some of these things like migration and so forth, which become the real targets. In Britain, it's slightly different, of course, Brexit, from what we see in the Donald Trump, but it's some of the targets are the same. It is, the European Union as a vehicle of some kind of globalization and undermining of sovereignty and so forth. That's really the big sell, I think, of UKIP and Boris Johnson and all the others.
Maybe I could come in here if I could. It's interesting to listen to two Europeans talk about the United States, but maybe we have an American voice talk about this topic. I just come back to your basic initial points that, everyone says this relationship is some crisis, constant crisis and conflict. But, frankly, it seems to me it's almost never been a case of Europe versus US conflict. Almost all the crises we're talking about are debates that are happening within Europe and within the United States. And the crisis lines are drawn across the Atlantic. They're not actually Europe versus, even the Iraq War was not Europe versus the US. Many European countries were absolutely gung-ho on it or participated in it in ways that a Franco-German perspective never understood, frankly. So I think one needs to step back and understand, what's different from that earlier period and the current period. And I do come back to this point that Christina had alluded to that I do write about, which I think during the Cold War, and in fact, the 20th century, if you want to do it with ups and downs, the United States became a constituent part of European construction, either through World Wars or Cold War, or even in helping to create the experiment of European integration. We were a European power in the sense of that, a constituent part of all the coalitions and bargains Europeans themselves were making. The US played a major role in all of that, a constituent role. And because the issue was we say transatlantic relations during that period, it was all about just Europe, really. That's why your comments about Suez and other things being peripheral, because the real issue was what to do about Europe. Europe had created 2 world wars, it was the center of the Cold War. What to do about Europe was the cardinal issue of US foreign policy for a century. And so when we talk about transatlantic relations, we talked about the European continent and what to do about it. But when the Cold War ended, that sort of basic equation, I think, shifted. It was no longer just about what's going on in Europe, but could we align the ongoing experiment of European integration with a change in perspective of the US-European relationship to talk about other parts of the world or other kinds of issues. And that was the test. Could Europe step up in American jargon to become the kind of partner we probably needed to deal with the lots of other issues or not? And I think corresponding to that was this 30-year paradigm in Europe in particular after the end of the Cold War that, as you said, Frank Fukuyama said history had ended. Thomas Bagger said, that was an American concept that became German reality. The notion that the end of the Cold War meant just a constantly expanding liberal order, magnetic to others who wanted to join into it, that was open to having those other countries join in. We have a question in the chat, what does this mean now, for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Turkey? But at that time, the premise was this would just continue. The United States would remain there, but kind of a benign supporter. Even Russia could find a place in this order. As Christina said, civilian power was the new mantra. Military power seems, passé. And all of this would just go on. And if I look at it, what I see is a tremendous, disillusionment within Europe about all of those premises today. The Europe we look at today, all of those spoken or unspoken premises have been shattered. The notion of ever closer union was shattered by Brexit and shattered by the notion in many Eurosceptic factions within Europe now, whether in fact there's going to be any more deeper integration. The idea that military power is passé, Mr. Putin had other ideas. You can change borders by force in Europe. Military power does matter. There's war going on in Europe right now. The idea that this interdependency would just create, benign linkages and prosperity. We see interdependence brings asymmetries of power. They can be manipulated by certain actors to get an enhanced position. And you mentioned, Jussi, the recession and also the migration flows, I would add, that leads Mr. Macron to talk about a Europe that protects as sort of the new mantra of Europe. Seen from my point of view, he's talking about a Europe that protects some Europeans from other Europeans. That's not exactly an expansive notion of Europe. So I come back to this about what's that mean for the United States' role in Europe. I think it comes down, in my view, to whether you think Europe is fragile or stable. I would argue it's inherently fluid and fragile. And the notion that somehow Europe is got a solid foundation under it and can be this autonomous, actor in a multipolar world seems to be very far from the Europe I'm looking at. And that's why it was so unsettling, it seems to me, when Donald Trump came into power and basically put in front of the Europeans the notion the Americans maybe are no longer a European power, but they're going to start acting like a power in Europe. Donald Trump questioned those premises, the unspoken premises of the European paradigm. He questioned NATO fundamentally. He questioned American commitments to European partners. He questioned whether European integration was good for the United States or whether we shouldn't just play off the Europeans against each other, which is frankly very easy to do. He questioned whether the rules-based order upon which the whole European experiment rests was a good thing. And he reflects not just Donald Trump, he reflects a deep strain in American society that thinks about multilateralism more in an instrumental way, as a tool, rather than as an existential way, which is what many Europeans would think about it. And that hasn't gone away. Mr. Trump is no longer president, but one should not dismiss these currents. So, this revisionist notion that not only China and Russia are revisionist, but the major partner of Europe is maybe a revisionist power, was deeply, deeply unsettling to Europe. And back to Christina's point of what would have happened if Donald Trump would have been reelected, I think you would have had a really very serious rupture across the Atlantic. But also within Europe, that was my point. It's not Europe versus the US. You would have had significant ruptures within Europe because the US holds lots of this together. It's not something Europeans like to hear. But I think, in the end, much of that is what's about this type of relationship. So I wonder what you think about all that and whether you agree or whether you think there are other things that we should take into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, really, really, really good points, Dan, and thanks again, Christina, also for provoking Dan into this direction. I think, you're right in so many ways. I think you're absolutely right about Europe being a fluid, fragile place. Fluid and fragile in a sense that the European Union construction that has taken place over the past few decades clearly has not created one Europe, but many Europes that are sort of held together by this thing we call the European Union. I think we've seen this sort of resort to national prerogatives very clearly in the last year or so with the coronavirus and the different measures being taken by different countries to combat it, and closing of borders and all the rest of it. I think that's absolutely true. I think you're absolutely right on the fact the United States matters more to Europe than the other way around. I think that's, I guess, my reading of one reading of what you just said, and I think that's why Donald Trump was so troubling. Yes, that's why Joe Biden has had such an easy time with Europe in his presidency so far, because there's been this collective sigh of relief that, you know, the bad boy's gone, and now we have somebody, you know, who was there before and who clearly sort of sends the right kind of signals in order to attract European support and to play the right multilateral card. I think in terms of what's going on in the United States, and my reading again is that basically it's always America first, right? No matter who the president is and what the words are, it's America first. I think, to me, what Biden is doing, multilateralism is a tool, and it's a tool for American power and American influence and so forth. It allows, it seems to me, and that was not, that's different from what you would see about Trump, perhaps, obviously in this regard, that multilateralism wasn't even a tool unless he could sort of use the things like NATO to twist the arms of the Germans and the French and so forth in the directions that he may have wanted, perhaps. But I'm not a good interpreter of Trump, having seen too many of his crazy tweets and been unable to sort of construct a coherent much out of that. So maybe we don't need to right away go there. But multilateralism, and we see this in the how United States has, not only with Europe, but, you know, more globally. I mean, United Nations, for the United States, what is it? Well, it's not really there. You know, it's not a purpose as such. It's a tool of something else. It's a tool of security. It's a tool of influence, or whatever that might be. So in that sense, I mean, I don't think there's much disagreement. I think I would add, though, that for the United States, at least in the perception of probably even the Trump administration, but certainly in the Biden administration right now, American power depends upon Europe still to a degree. It doesn't necessarily depend upon a united Europe, but it depends upon Europe. It depends on those historic relationships with Europe, which is why I think we saw Joe Biden go, you know, through G7 and NATO and the EU before he then came to my hometown and to shake hands with Vladimir and give him a lecture and go away and not really get anything out of Vladimir in return. But I think that was a demonstration in some ways that, you know, as he puts it, America is back, but it's back in a sort of playing the leading role in this regard. But it's not purely a one-way dependency, and I think that's something that I would. And maybe last point, just in terms of debates about America, I think you're again, in many ways, right when you say that it's Europeans debate this, that we do it. I mean, no American ever watches an election in Europe and stays up all night or all week, as it was case in November, to find out what the result is. And that's already one indication. I mean, that's a sort of anecdotal indication of where still the influence and power and so forth lies in this relationship. At the same time, the dividing lines, and here again, like you mentioned the Iraq War, for example, yes, I mean, this is the other thing, and for dramatic effect, did not mention this in the beginning, but of course the debate was massive within the United States about the righteousness or not about the Iraq War and demonstrations and all of this. And they were reminiscent why I brought up Vietnam in that context back in 2003. To me, they reminded something about the dividing lines about that war in terms of how, as you know, historically well known, Americans, many thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans were against that war. And so were many hundreds of thousands and millions of Europeans demonstrating against that war. And so that to me was another indication of not a transatlantic divide. There were no anti-Americans in that context, as far as I can tell. There were those who were against the war and those who were for it. And so in that sense, that also told me something about how the same issues were debated, and American foreign policy and its side effects in this regard were debated at great intensity, both within the United States and in Europe. And I think that also, in some ways, that's sort of, I use that as a point to sort of argue that, in fact, there is a political space. Because Trump is an issue in the United States, Trump is an issue.
There's a noisy debate across the Atlantic on all of these with different coalitions and factions. That's what democracies do. You know, there's this book by Peter Baldwin called The Narcissism of Small Differences, where he takes on, and it was interesting to me in your book, you didn't really get into the societal piece. That would be a sort of fourth pillar if you wanted to talk about it. We talk a lot about societal differences across the Atlantic, but if you look deeply, you see all sorts of societal connections as well that don't correspond to this country in Europe and this, you know, and the United States. Certain U.S. states are much more similar to many European countries than they might be to other U.S. states. You know, and I think an important addition to that we keep that in mind. I think your other point is important, which is what John Eikenberry, you know, calls the American system. Which is, why did the U.S. have so much power? It wasn't just because of its national power. It was because it had constructed a network of allies and partners all around the world, not just in Europe, that really supported it. And there was a tacit bargain. You know, the hegemon, if you will, provides collective goods, and the others join in that because it helps them too. And that bargain was what was at question in the last number of years. Donald Trump viewed those networks of allies as a burden. They were dragging America down. It was not seen as an asset. It was seen as, you know, weighting us down. We need to be free of these free riders, or they should pay up. There was a transactional approach. Joe Biden is going back to a more traditional approach to revitalize those networks. But I think the sigh of relief you mentioned in Europe, it could be short-lived, because frankly, Joe Biden expects more of Europe than Donald Trump ever did. This is just the beginning. We're back, but you got to step up is the second message. The 2% clause in NATO was the Obama-Biden administration. It wasn't the Trump administration. You know, and so there is a clear expectation in the United States that Europe needs to shoulder more of the burden, not just in NATO, but overall. And that runs into some sense in Europe that Europe is already the leader in lots of these things. The US is sort of catching up to it. So we have a perception gap here, I think, with the new administration. And I think it'll become clearer as, you know, as time goes on. I just wanted to bring in a couple of questions here that I've tried to weave in a few that came in, but there is one question about the notion of the West itself. There wasn't I think when you started, the one questioner thought maybe you were equating NATO with the West, and I don't think you probably intended that, but I wonder if you say something about how you think this, you know, what do you understand to be the West? Is that even a relevant term anymore? Or should we be thinking about something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, you know, it's a fundamental question in many ways. And of course, the way we think about the West, well, historians, certainly Cold War historians, we sort of had this intuitive understanding. We knew East and we knew West, and, you know, that's how the world sort of was divided at some point. And of course, in the post-Cold War era, it's difficult to use that term. In the same way, it's difficult to talk about the free world as something very meaningful, or sort of as a catchphrase. I think today, you know, if somebody told me 2 years ago Donald Trump is the leader of the free world, I would have said, what are you talking about? And if you know, be an interesting conversation perhaps afterwards. So the way I see the West, so there's a part of the is not. It's built upon the sort of the Cold War legacy, which Christina already talking about, you know, the end of history and so forth. The idea that was very popular and still is popular in many circles, that something called the West won the Cold War, right? And what the point of the first chapter is to think, okay, if that was the common sense at the moment, and it's become a useful political trope. Usually it's added to that is that Ronald Reagan, as the leader of the West, won the Cold War, hence votes Republican, or something like that. In sort of some political debates, you would hear that. It's been questioned, of course. It's a much more complex process and so forth. But what I wanted to use it as simply as a sort of tool to get into thinking about the prehistory of the post-Cold War era in terms of transatlantic relations. And within that context, the West seemed to have meant something. And I come from Finland, and you know, the usual phrase in Finland always, well, we're between East and West, right? Because we're neutral. And so we're somewhere in the between. We don't really West, we're not really, certainly not the East. I mean, that's clear, but we're somewhere in between. We're between East and West. So I used to just ask, so what was this West that won the Cold War? To get into my actual topic, and I don't think it's you know, is it a place? Is it an idea? Is it a set of arrangements, institutional or otherwise? So, and I think the answer is actually yes to all of that. That in some ways you could point the West, the Cold War West at least, and the way it relates to the topic of transatlantic relations, you could sort of fairly narrowly define it as a geopolitical space. United States, North America, United States, Canada, and Western Europe. Roughly NATO, but of course they were honorary members of the West. Switzerland or Sweden perhaps, and you know, some sort of neutral Austria, maybe even Finland, although the Finns were very hush-hush about that. But it was, you know, it was in a sense that it was a West. It was combined with, you know, the ideological, you know, this was the so-called free world. This was where democracy was practiced and so forth. But it wasn't, you know, you could still be in the West and perhaps be somewhat authoritarian and in some concepts. So yeah, so I think the short answer to the question is no, it's not the same as NATO. Rather, the sort of the collection of alliances of institutional relationship of a group of countries in which the United States was the dominant partner. Whether it was the economic relationships, whether it was the alliance relationships that we think about, that sort of acted, relatively speaking, in unison in the context of the pre-1990 era. And what I wanted to find out in a book, in a sense, how does that West, does it survive beyond that, beyond the Cold War, or evolve? And one of the arguments there is that in fact it grows, but doesn't become a global phenomenon in a sense, in a ways that those who talked about the end of history and talked about the never-ending march of liberalism and so forth, perhaps anticipated back in 1990.
Right. You know, Thomas Kleine-Borkhoff has a book about, he defines different ways of thinking about the West. You know, at its best, you could say the West is the West of the Enlightenment. So it's about democracy, economy, human rights, rule of law, that type of West. But of course, seen from other perspective, the West is also a racist, exclusionary, culturally, you know, nativist concept that has not been at its best. And one has to deal with that. And then there's sort of the institutional West. That's the institutions that were created among these countries that have its own thing. Timothy Garton Ash, you know, made a distinction. He said, you know, we shouldn't talk about the free world anymore. Let's just talk about free world. And free world means lots of other countries can be part of that. I think what you're seeing right now is an effort to try to get it beyond those categories and build coalitions of democracies, sort of variable geometry types of coalitions that include many other countries in the Indo-Pacific, as well as Europe and the United States. And that's at least sort of the Biden administration approach. And it'll be a redefining of, our relationship. Last word, Christina.
I just wanted to throw in the mix from sort of political perspective. What you described, both of you described, was in some ways how we in the West describe the West or try to use the term. And if you only think of Putin's commentary in the German newspaper last week on the occasion of the Operation Barbarossa, 8 years, and he spoke about that countries in Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War got the choice between the collective West and Russia, then we can see how in a geopolitical way the word gets again turned into a different it gets a slightly different spin of what that means. Whereas if you, in some ways, if you use it in that benign way and you sort of say it's institutional, it may have to do with values, all this sort of spirit of cooperation that was discussed at the end of the Cold War and taken forward, then it's quite interesting that that's where you see this sort of hovering used politically by, for example, the man in the Kremlin who says, well, there's Russia and Russian values versus that collective West, which is like, this sort of bulwark. And that's quite interesting because, and at the same time, he's saying in the same piece, well, we are also looking to the Pacific, but actually our cultural civilizational space as Russians is in Europe. And then you start to ask, well, if it's in Europe and there's a Euro-Atlantic or a transatlantic space, where exactly are the lines of division if there are.
Thank you so much. We need to end now. Christina Spohr, thank you for joining us so much and adding so much to this debate. Jussi, thank you for presenting your book. Go out and buy it, everyone. Oxford University Press, any electronic medium you can get it. I want to thank my colleagues, Christian Ostermann and Peter Bierstecker from the History and Public Policy program, and our AV team and my own team for all of this. This will be, I think, available as a recording that people can watch in the future. Thank you again. Take care. Have a good day.